Good evening, everyone, and many thanks for being here tonight. It's quite cold, so you all sort of managed to be here. That's wonderful. And thank you for being here for an evening discussion on the long-term health effects of war and humanitarian crisis, the Holodomor and Health Heritage. My name is Anneliese Bobeldijk, and I'm the moderator of tonight. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen University, and where I'm part of the Heritage of Hunger project, and I research there specifically the use and abuse of history and the legacy of Soviet famines, and more specifically the Holodomor and the hunger during the Leningrad blockade. I have a background in the study of history, the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and more specifically in Belarus. Coming from these two fields of studies, I'm very happy to moderate tonight's fascinating panel and to bring perhaps an additional factor into the discussion, history and heritage from a more broader sense than just health heritage. After all, the link that is drawn tonight is the analogy between what is happening today in Ukraine and what happened roughly 80 years ago in Soviet Ukraine during the Holodomor. The term Holodomor refers to the period between 1932 and 1934, during which Ukraine, but also the Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Volga, and North Caucasus regions, suffered tremendous losses due to the famine that occurred as a consequence of the collectivization of the individual agricultural assets and the confiscation of grain and other foodstuffs by the Soviet authorities. Tonight we will discuss the new study of Ola Volevenia, Natalia Levchuk, and Professor Bertie Lumey about the long-term health effects of the Holodomor. But before they will discuss their study, Professor Lumey asked me to shortly introduce the topic of the Holodomor from my point of view as a historian and memory scholar. After this, Ole, Natalia and Bertie will give a short presentation about their findings, which will be followed by a short podium discussion. And then there is also some space for questions from you all. In general, there are 3 points that I would like to make regarding the Holodomor, its history and memory. First of all, I would like to underline the fact that even though today the Holodomor is rather well known, a rather well-known phenomenon, in particular since February last year, following the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it is good to remember that this was not always the case. The famine was always silenced during the Soviet period. For my own research, I look, for example, at Soviet textbooks, and there's no famine to be found there with regards to the 1930s. Interestingly, during the secret speech of Khrushchev during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, in which he addressed the cult of personality of Stalin, and in which he denounced the crimes that took place during the Great Terror in the late 1930s, the famine was never mentioned. The famine, or the Holodomor, gained mostly attention during the 1980s, during which, in the first place, Ukrainian diaspora brought this more to the fore, as well the occurrence of more public interest into the Holodomor in Ukraine itself. After the independence of Ukraine, the Holodomor became a cornerstone in nation building, and also fueled feelings of Ukrainian nationalism and resentment of Russia as a colonizer of the Ukrainian nation. What is connected to this is the second point I would like to make. That is that it is important to understand that during the Soviet period, the archives that contain essential information on what happened during the Holodomor were all closed, and we will come back to that. It is important to realize that it was only after the independence of Ukraine that these archives were opened. This is a well-known moment for people who study the history of the Holocaust and the Stalinist terror, because this brought new research possibilities and brought the opportunity to shine a light on topics which were earlier difficult to research. For the topic of the Holodomor, this applies as well. Demographic data that was not easily accessible or was influenced, as we will discuss later, was also in these archives. For example, Robert Conquest, who wrote the first English monograph on the Holodomor, Harvest of Sorrow, in 1986, did so without any access to the archives in the former Soviet Union, and later on acknowledged that some aspects of his work might have been different if he would have had access to them. The third and final point I would like to make prior to starting the lecture of tonight is the use and abuse of history. We will most likely come to speak of this as well, but I would like to point out that from the very first day of the invasion of Ukraine, history has been used for various goals, such as legitimizing. Think of Putin, who tried to legitimize the war by claiming that there's no such thing as Ukrainian history and therefore a Ukrainian nation or any right of sovereignty. Or connecting. Think of Ukrainian President Zelensky, who cleverly managed to find common ground with countries that he online visited in order to ask for support, such as the Netherlands, in which he evoked the common ground of history, where he drew the analogy to the bombing of Rotterdam. And the analogy he drew, for example, to the Berlin airlift at the German Bundestag. The war caused for history to be evoked on a broad scale to connect countries, nations and people. Very recently in the European Parliament, a direct line was drawn between the Holodomor and the current situation in Ukraine by discussing the two topics in one session in which the Holodomor was recognized as a genocide. This is the use of history only on a discursive or abstract level, but physically it has been abused as well. In occupied parts of Ukraine, monuments of the Holodomor have been demolished, museums have been plundered, and new history books have been introduced to the curricula. To conclude, even though history is always used as a political tool and for political agendas, the war in Ukraine has also shown that history is now actually being used as a weapon against the Ukrainian nation and their citizens. I will leave this thought with you. And we will probably come back to this during either the presentation or the discussion. And I would very much like to introduce three speakers of tonight to you. First of all, Natalia Levchuk. She's a senior researcher at the Tuga Institute of Demography and Social Studies of the National Academy of Social Sciences in Ukraine, Kiev. She was a fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock, Germany, and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute in Boston. She has published extensively on regional differences between various regions in 1932 and 1934 about the Holodomor, both on oblast and rayon level. Then Ola Volovinya is a research fellow at the Center for Slavic, Eurasian and Eastern European Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and director of the Center for Demographic and Socioeconomic Research on Ukrainians in the United States, the Shevchenko Scientific Society in New York. He has published extensively on the 1932-1934 famine in Ukraine and on Ukrainians in the United States and Canada. And then last but not least, Professor Lambert Lumay is professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University Medical Center in New York, and a visiting fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, which is hosting sort of this evening, the NIAS in Amsterdam. He has published extensively on the immediate and long-term impact of Ukrainian famine, the Dutch hunger winter famine of 1944-1945, and the Chinese Great Leap Forward famine of 1959-1961. So I would like to invite Ola to the, and Natalia, both? Or one? Okay. Yeah. For your presentation.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to extend my admiration for your city, Amsterdam. This is my first visit. I am so impressed. I hope I had more time to enjoy this city. Unfortunately, time is short, but it was so wonderful to be in your city. Sometimes in life things happen all of a sudden that change the course of your life. And this is what happened with the project that we work on the Holodomor. On my first Fulbright grant to Ukraine, I came to Kyiv to work at the Institute of Demography, where Natalia works, and I had a topic that had nothing to do with the Holodomor. But when I came there, I realized, number one, members of the Institute were not really excited about my proposed topic, and I met this demographer, Umberlan Rudnitsky, that during the Soviet times, in secret gathered all kinds of data and documents about the Holodomor, and started talking to him, and he was a walking encyclopedia on the topic. On top of that, something that very few people know, the first Institute of Demography created in the Western Hemisphere was in Kyiv in 1919, when the first government of Free Ukraine was fighting for its life. And a group of demographers did fantastic job during several decades, and all the scientific work they produced was in the lab of the Institute, but was not being analyzed. So when I saw that, I went to the Fulbright office in Kyiv and said, this is the situation, here is a gold mine of information, data on the Holodomor, that I would like to change my topics and start research on this topic. They agreed. I got together a group of demographers at the Institute, and that's how the project was started. And Natalia will give you details about how we started working.
Is it working? Yes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Oleg already said that when he arrived in our institute and initiated this project, actually my colleague and I were quite excited about that. But when we started searching for the data, we discovered that it's an easy task. Because let me briefly mention, it is worth mentioning here that there are two types of statistics on vital events, or two types of sources on birth and death. One type is individual records, records on birth and death in so-called birth and death books, issued and collected by the Civil Registration Office in Ukraine at the level of village, city, district. But the second type of statistics and information about birth and death that we needed to collect, to analyze, and then to estimate losses from the famine, this is aggregated data. Collected at the level of district and then oblast, which is region in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the first type of data, individual records, only a small part of this data survived until now. Only a small part is available. So we cannot use this data for our research. That's why our research is relied on aggregated data, even though individual records have really important information about birth and death, individual characteristic of the person. So we started searching for the aggregated data, and then again discovered that no such data is available in Kyiv archive. But they are still kept and stored in Moscow archive. Why? The reason is as follows. So, my colleague Oleg already mentioned him. His name is Umberlan Rudnitsky. He told us that during Soviet time, in the mid of 1980s, he had some brief talk to another man who also worked at statistical office. Emelian Rudnitsky worked at Central Statistical Office in Kiev at that time, and his colleague. So he told him a story that in 1941, during the Second World War, when the war started already, in summer, in early July of 1941, before Nazis occupied the city of Kiev, Soviet authorities, before this occupation, decided to destroy vital statistics for Ukraine for the 1930s. And basically, they burn these materials. There are no official documents to prove this hypothesis, but that might be true. But luckily, original copies were destroyed. Original documents, original statistical reports. But the copies of these reports were sent to Moscow and kept in Central Statistical Office in Moscow. So that was the reason why we decided to go to Russia, to work at Russian archive in Moscow, to search for this data that we needed to collect, to make copies. I went to Moscow three times in 2012 with my colleague, and then second and third time in early 2014. That was really difficult time in Ukraine. So we went in late February, just a few days after the former Ukrainian President Yanukovych fled the country. That was time just a few days after mass killing in the city of Kiev, in the center of Kiev, killing of mass protesters during the time that we now call the Revolution of Dignity. So we went to, my colleague and I, we arrived in Moscow during our trip from Central Railway Station to the hotel in Moscow. A taxi driver asked us many questions because it was, just a few days after all these events. We also visited archives, tried to find as many documents as possible to collect them. And then in a month, I think it was late March 2014, I went to Moscow again to pick the document, to pick all the documents, to pick up, and to deliver them to Kiev, to our institute. And that was, in the end of March, when Russia already started invasion of the Crimea and annexation of the Crimea. They annexed the Crimea. That was the time when already pro-Russian-based separatists started all these riots in Donbass region. That was the time when actually the war in eastern Ukraine started. But luckily, we found the data that we needed, and we started working with this data. Also, maybe I would like to acknowledge the contribution of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute because they help us in many ways, and the Great Famine project developed by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute actually was the very first one of the broader atlas, which is called MAPA Digital Atlas of Ukraine, developed by HURI, by Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And they use our data, our estimates of the famine losses as a basis for their maps. So now you can find a lot of maps on their website. Maybe I stop here. Yeah.
Okay. This is just a brief presentation. This? Yeah. Okay. So this is just a brief presentation of main aspects of the Holodomor to indicate the extent of the famine that many people are not aware of. And the second point is to try to clarify some misconceptions about the famine. Oh, okay. Is it okay now? All right. So first, the first misconception that is, mentioned the famine in the Soviet Union, that everybody suffered the same. So we did an analysis of the Soviet republics to estimate the number of losses in each republic. And you see that number one is 3.9 million for Ukraine, number two, 3.2 million in Russia, and then number three, 1.2 million in Kazakhstan. All the other republics had very few losses, relatively speaking. But if you standardize population size, we see that Kazakhstan had the highest level of losses, 22% of the population, Ukraine 13%, and Russia only 3%. So the myth that everybody suffered the same during the famine actually turns out to be not correct. Now, okay, this is what we have for Ukraine. I would like to point out basically two numbers. Number one at the bottom of the screen, that the great majority of the losses were in rural areas, more than 90%. But one very important fact is that almost 90% of all the losses occurred in 1 year, in 1933. And we'll see later on the importance of this. So we estimated the losses for the regions of Ukraine, and you see that the higher losses are in Kyiv and Kharkiv Oblast, while the south had lower losses. But the fact is that the south is the grain-growing region, while the north is not the grain-growing region. So the second myth is that the famine, the main cause was collectivization and requisition of grain. Turns out to be not true, because the grain-growing regions had fewer losses than the not grain-growing regions because of political reasons. So that's, so to speak, myth number two. But you see that at the oblast level, you had in 1 year 18% losses in one province. But at the municipal region, like Rayon, in some cases we had almost 50% of the rural population of a certain region died because of the famine. So the impact at certain regions was really extraordinary. But there's another point. In 1933, if you look at the losses by month, you see that in the first half of 1933, there was a huge increase of losses between January and June of that year. And if you look at the losses in January and compare them to the losses in June, for the whole Ukraine, the number of losses increased 10 times. In some provinces, increased 15 and 14 times. Something that unheard of in any other famine in Europe. And this is probably the best indicator, which is the average number of losses per day in each month. In January, there were 3,000 losses per day. In February, 4,000. In March, 9,000. April, 13. May, 19. In June, there were 28,000 deaths due to the famine per day in the country. So this gives you some idea of the magnitude of the Holodomor, which is much, much higher than in other parts of Russia, as you will see from Natalia's presentation. And just to give you another indicator that is used in demography, life expectancy at birth. This indicates that if you are born in 1933 and the famine at that level continues the rest of your life. On the average, a male would live less than 6 years, while the female would live less than only 9 years. So the tremendous impact of this famine in life expectancy as shown in these data. And finally, our project with Dr. Lumi is the implication of this famine for health. In this case, the probability that if a pregnant woman is subject to this intense famine, the children later in adult life have a much higher probability of developing diabetes type 2. So we have here that if we compare the birth in the first semester of 1933, and we divide this by extreme famine, severe, significant, you will see that we have a peak at the first semester of 34. This is the birth that started the inception 9 months before at the peak of the famine. So we have a tremendous effect of the famine of the fetus, and then the life of the children later on in life. So this is one example of the effect in the health area of this famine Holodomor. Natalia.
Let me elaborate a little bit what just Oleg mentioned. The argument that both Russia and Ukraine suffered from the famine in 1932-33 to the same extent. He already mentioned that our estimates of the famine losses in Ukraine, we estimated at 3.9 million excess deaths for Ukraine and also 3.3 million for Russia. But these numbers are absolute numbers, but in relative terms, that is excess deaths per 1,000 or per 100 population. In relative terms, the losses in Ukraine are much higher. Actually, Russia's losses are about 4 times smaller than in Ukraine, because in Ukraine it's about 13% of the total population, but in Russia it's only 3% of the total population. And in Ukraine it's about 16% of rural population, while in Russia it's just 3.5%. But another argument which is very common and popular in Russian historiography of the Soviet famine, that even though there are some differences between Ukraine and Russia in terms of losses, but those areas that suffer the most are grain-producing regions in both Ukraine and Russia. So all the major grain-producing regions of both Soviet republics at that time suffered from the famine to the same extent. And that's why the intensity of the famine in both republics was determined exclusively just by grain procurement quotas, just by the grain specialization of the region. So here on this slide, I just want again to show you the differences, the regional variation in excess deaths for Ukraine by oblast or by region. It works? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Oleg already showed the map, and here we have a bar plot. So Ukraine consisted that time, there were 7 oblasts, plus Moldova Republic in Ukraine. And if you look at the map, at the excess deaths in relative terms by region, Kiev and Kharkiv suffered the most with 19-20% of population. Here we have per 1,000 of population, but also possible to recalculate per 100 population. So 19 to 20%. Then Vinnytsia, Moldova, and Odessa from 10 to 13%, and Chernihiv in Donetsk 5 to 9%. Yeah, it's the lowest level of losses, but still it's significant. 5 to 9% of population died due to the famine in these regions of Ukraine. And now let me show you Russian. We estimated losses from the famine in terms of excess deaths for Russia. First, for 17 regions of Russia, covering the whole territory of Ukraine, 7 large regions of Russia, but also, in addition, 2 small sub-regions were singled out. Saratov Oblast and Volga-German Republic within Lower Volga Krai, and Krasnodar Krai within North Caucasus Krai, because we wanted to estimate losses for these sub-regions to get more detailed information what was going on in precisely in this region, because we were interested in that. So we have a total of 20 regions covering the whole territory of Ukraine. And as you see on the top, 3 regions, sub-regions that I just mentioned, Saratov, Volga-German, and Krasnodar Krai, suffered the highest losses. Actually, Volga-German rate of excess deaths is very similar to what to estimates for Kyiv and Kharkiv Oblast, but only Volga-German, I would say, very similar. Then the second group consists of Lower Volga and North Caucasus, excluding these 3 sub-regions, smaller sub-regions that I just mentioned. Then the third group is made up of Siberia, Ural, Central Volga Krai, and thank you. And Central Black Earth Oblast, with relative losses in percent, it would be 3 to 4% of total population. Crimea is, I think, in gray color, yeah. It's in the fourth group that is made up of the, I think, largest number of regions. And the fifth group composed of Leningrad, Western Oblast, Gorky Krai, Central Industrial. Losses in this oblast were actually negligible. So very, very low level. So what conclusions can be made based on these bar plots? First, regional variations of excess deaths within Ukraine is much larger, more substantial than in Russia. Because the differences between excess deaths in Kharkiv Oblast, for instance, or Kyiv on the one side, and Chernihiv and Donetsk on the other side, it's at least 4 times, between 5% and 20%. But in Russia, it's much larger. Actually, excess deaths vary from very high losses to very low losses, or almost no losses. Second, the regions that were seriously affected by the famine comprised in Ukraine a much larger proportion in terms of both territory and population compared to Russia. The most affected regions in Russia encompass about 6% of rural population and 1% of its territory. Let me just tell you that Volga-German Republic, it's 500,000 people at that time, while Kyiv and Kharkiv, each of them actually maybe 5-6 million at that time. The majority of regions in Russian Federation have less than 0.5% of rural excess deaths per 100 population. And the third conclusion, if I show you this map we have such map for the whole territory of Russian Federation, but here I present only European Russia by region and Ukraine also by oblast. Oleg already mentioned that in Ukraine, oblasts that suffered the highest losses due to the famine were Kiev and Kharkiv. And if you remember the map of the losses at the district level, it's central part of Ukraine, which is forest steppe zone of Ukraine. It is not the steppe, it is not the south, it is not Odessa or Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, the main grain producing regions of Ukraine at that time. While in Russia, it is the case. All these regions with the highest losses, Volga-German Republic, Saratov Oblast, and Krasnodar Krai, actually were the major grain-producing, grain-growing regions of Russia. So that's what our estimates revealed in terms of comparison between Ukraine and Russia, between and within these two countries.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very impressive presentation and the very impressive work you gathered, actually. Because if I understood correctly, you first managed to gather all demographic data and later showed how the deaths or death rates differed per region. I was wondering if I can start with the first questions. In this map, you can see that there were certain areas of Ukraine and Russia that seem to have been targeted more than other regions. As you say, that the myth that especially the grain-producing regions were the ones that suffered, you actually showed that this was different. Can you perhaps elaborate on what sort of conclusions we can draw from that, and whether this might have been political decisions that were the cause of this?
Yes. As you saw, that there was famine in 32, was fairly high. A lot of people were dying all over the country. But something happened in late 32, beginning of 33. Historians divided Holodomor in two parts. One was basically general type of Soviet famine, although we saw that the highest levels were not in the grain producing. So there was something else besides collectivization. But by the end of 32, Stalin introduced three measures that made the famine not a regular famine, but hunger was used as a weapon of terror, to terrorize the country for political reasons. What happened? First, that there were quotas that peasants were supposed to fulfill and give the grain to the state. They were so high, they were not able to fulfill them. So brigades went village to village looking for hidden grain in peasants' houses. They would dig out the garden, they check the roof of the house, and we have thousands of testimonials that when they came looking for the grain, whether they found the grain or not, in many cases took all the food, including the pot on the stove. So they took away all the food that people were stored to survive the winter. They were left without any food. Second, in 32, many peasants started traveling to Russia searching for food because there was food in Russia. They would take things that they had, they could barter for food, and there were thousands and thousands. So when Stalin got those reports, he said, we got to stop this. So in early January, they rounded up all these peasants, sent them back to the village, and they closed the border. So on the one hand, many households were left without any food, and they were not able to travel to look for food. And third, in order to supplement the quota, this was only in Ukraine, basically, they took away the grain that was stored for emergencies, and they also took the grain that was kept for the seed grain for the next harvest. So those grains that may have been used at the peak of the famine were gone. So you had like a perfect storm of three measures that basically condemned whole villages to a slow death of starvation. So that's why we say that the famine became a genocide, because hunger was used to break the spirit of the peasant, which was the core of the culture. It had nothing to do with collectivization, and that's where the bulk of the people died in that first 6 months of 33.
Thank you very much for this. I think perhaps we can come back to what is currently happening in Russia, or in Ukraine, sorry, what is taking place because of Russia in Ukraine. And you mentioned food as a weapon. Perhaps you can speak in the case of the Holodomor of slow violence in a way, of different types of violence. Perhaps, Professor Lemay, perhaps you can reflect shortly on what is happening in Ukraine today and how the long-term effects of what is happening there might affect future generations, as we also saw from this presentation that we still see long-term health effects from the Holodomor.
We looked, do I have a noise? Yes. We used the data that were put together by the demographic colleagues, because they are a very unique collection of births and deaths worldwide. In more detail than any other country of the world, we have over a very long period births and deaths that allow us to define the population at risk. And in epidemiology, we like to have a population at risk at birth, and then see how many diseases develop in that population at risk. So of every 1,000 born, maybe 50 will get diabetes. And this depends, we think, on the living conditions at the place of birth, on the parents. But in this instance, because of the very extreme famine, the very sudden onset, the very sudden cessation, only a 6-month period, we could identify the impact of the famine on the long term. And because of the work that was done in reconstituting the births, we know the population at risk, not only in each year, but also in regions with very severe famine, medium famine, and no famine, and also by month of birth, and only for men and women separately. And by analyzing the data month by month by month, we realize that only 6 months out of the 8-year time series between 1930 and 1938 generated a peak in diabetes later. And these 6 months were the births in the first half year of 1934. Putting together the information from the historians that pinpoint the peak of the famine in the first 6 months of 1933, we know that there is a relation between being conceived at the time of the famine, being in the womb, in the early stage of pregnancy, and having a double risk of diabetes 60, 70, 80 years later. So from the biological research point of view, we can learn about the timing and the long-term effects and the critical periods. And from the political point of view, we can say that the stress and the famine today are likely to have long-term effects in addition to what is happening today.
Perhaps, do you want to add something to that? It looked...
add something? No, I think Dr. Lumi covered.
Yeah. Perhaps there are some questions from the audience regarding the topic that was discussed. I see someone.
Thank you. In terms of long-term effects, did you look at also the Argentinian, Ukrainian diaspora, Canadian, and United States, and were there differences in the health outcomes of people in those countries that of Ukrainian background?
Well, some of the survivors migrated to these countries, but we don't have the data for these people. We have the data people that were born in Ukraine, and this is the linkage with the database on people with diabetes in Ukraine, that live in Ukraine. So the connection is only for people living in Ukraine, because you don't have data on people with diabetes that migrate to other countries. That's why we are not able to analyze that, right? Yes.
I hate to ask this question, but if you were to speculate, would there be a difference, or would it be the same health outcomes?
Probably Dr. Lumi can answer that question.
You mean for people living in Argentina?
Argentina, United States, and Canada, which were the three, Canada and Argentina, were the big diaspora.
We don't know. All we know in general, people who migrate, who leave their country of origin, have special reasons for doing so and also have special opportunities. So they could be richer and able to leave. They could be poorer and want to leave, but also they're more energetic because they take the initiative to leave. So all these factors are hard to disentangle, but they lead in many examples to show that the immigrants are healthier than the original population, a healthy immigrant effect. So that means that we cannot really say how this plays out for people who move to Argentina or elsewhere, because all we know is that they are likely not to represent the general population that they are leaving. They're a special group.
Thank you for your presentation and for showing these data. And you showed something about diabetes. I was wondering whether there is some research into other diseases and also into the psychological consequences of the enormous stress and trauma that people must have gone through during this Holodomor, but also in the Second World War. Yeah, is there any research on that? And also, I can imagine that because of severe malnutrition, children being conceived during the Holodomor may have a slower or a different brain development intrauterine, and if there is any research on that.
You point to one of the dilemmas of these types of studies, because it is impossible to study the factors you mentioned in isolation. A famine environment will be an environment of extreme stress as well. A famine the psychological effects have been very well documented also in the long-term impact of families in Holland after the Dutch hunger winter, or Jewish families who lost their parents and children who grew up. These types of studies are usually focused on individual families and witness stories, and we don't have a reliable measure at the population level. In this instance, the reason we have been able to look at diabetes is because that the individuals with diabetes in Ukraine now qualify for government-provided insulin and medical care, and are then, so it's their advantage to seek attention, and then they are also registered. So we have a reliable estimate of some disease outcome at the national level. So the reason we're able to report on diabetes is because the data happen to be available for an outcome that is reasonably well measured. But the outcomes you suggest are most likely also to be present, but they are a lot more difficult to investigate.
Do you have a bit more information on the people who died during the famine, like age or socio-economic position, or was it just purely geographic? That's why people passed away during the famine.
I'll take the first part. The first part of the answer is that in general, it's the most frail people, the weakest people that die. And in many of the famines we look at, these are the very young, the infants, the under 1-year-olds, and the older people, especially older men. But I think that in the Ukraine case, the environment is very different, so that maybe the increased mortality will be across all ages.
I would like to add what just Professor Lumay said. Yes, the most vulnerable age groups are children and people in older ages, yeah? So they have really high risk of death due to the famine or famine-related diseases, because it's not just famine. It's some other diseases which famine make it possible to die because of starvation. So yes, we have estimation of the excess deaths by age and by sex, and our estimates confirm this higher risk of deaths in, for instance, for infants. There was increase in several times and in older ages, but excess deaths also are distributed across all age groups, not just concentrated in the beginning of age profile and in the end. No, across all age groups. But there are some differences between urban-rural populations. So the risk is increasing with the age. It's understandable. It's higher in older ages. And so the age where this increase starts, it's much, this age is much younger for rural populations than for urban populations, because young people in urban areas who studied at school, at universities, students, they at least had some chance to survive because they received some food ratios compared to the peasants, which were starved to death because they didn't receive anything. So we can easily follow this increase and justify this increase at the age. In rural areas, for rural population, it starts in much younger ages than for urban population, because urban residents at least had something. They received something, some food, I mean, and they had chance to survive compared to peasants. Maybe Oleg?
No, I think that's good.
So just building on what you just said, then it puzzles me, and maybe you can provide an explanation why the two oblasts, Kiev and Kharkiv, with the biggest cities, have the highest mortality and excess deaths. Did that occur not in the cities, but in the rural parts of these oblasts? Can you explain a little bit what happened there?
Yes, you're right. Kiev and Kharkiv Oblast at that time were really large oblasts compared to contemporary Kiev and Kharkiv Oblast. So at that time, Kiev Oblast included at least 3 contemporary oblasts, yeah? And the really high level of losses in Kiev and Kharkiv was observed not in the cities, but in the area outside of the cities, because including very small towns. But in Kiev, yes, the level is much, much lower than outside of Kiev. The same refers to Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv. Even in the neighborhood of Kharkiv, there were really high level of mortality.
Actually, there was a stratification within the cities. In other words, Stalin engaged in a very aggressive industrialization program. So cities that had large industrial complexes were favored. But a city like Kiev didn't have large industrial complexes. So even within the cities, they got relatively less food assignated that, for example, cities in Dnipropetrovsk or Donetsk in the east. That's why you see the much lower levels of famine in the east part, because that's where the big complexes were, and they were well fed, relatively speaking, the worker in those. So within the cities, there was stratification as well.
Just 2 questions. The numbers are fantastic. It's a kind of heroic piece of work. Was the periodization of excess mortality the same in Saratov and in the German Volga Republic as it was in Ukraine? In other words, was the peak there also in the first 6 months of 33? That's the first question. And the second then is there agreement now as to what the harvest of 1932 was like? You know, was it a deficit harvest? Was it more deficient in some areas than in others? Was it more deficient in Ukraine than, say, in Russia? Is there agreement on those kind of issues now?
I'll answer the first question. Natalia knows more about the second question. So the first question was, remind me, please.
Just the periodization of the...
Oh yes. Well, I didn't show the graph. There is also a kind of a curve in the Russian regions. And because Saratov and, well, we don't have the data for the German Republic because we don't have data by month. But we do have in Saratov and in Krasnodar, Northern Caucasus. That slope is similar to the middle slope in Ukraine and the regions, but still is not as pronounced as in the highest peaks in the oblast in Ukraine. Now, in the pure Russian region, so to speak, the slope is minimal. So this increase you see basically in Ukraine and in a few regions, but because of the nationality factor. because you had Ukrainians and Germans, basically. That's why. Otherwise, there was hardly any peak there.
Regarding your second question, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to your question because this discussion about the total amount of harvest in summer of 1932 in Ukraine and Russia, even total numbers, it's a highly, I would say, controversial topic. This discussion started many years ago among historians, US historians, Russian historians, many experts, and still the numbers are not finalized yet. Some say that the harvest in Ukraine in summer of 1932 was okay. No droughts, no detrimental impact of weather conditions. Some say no, there was some detrimental effect, and that's why harvest was reduced, and that was mostly Russian historians say. And that was the reason, like precondition for why Ukraine didn't fulfill grain procurement quotas. To date, we can just say about the figures of planned grain procurement quotas, actual grain procurement quotas, but we cannot say nothing, like no detailed information, even no information about total harvest. No. There is a lot of controversy. There is no agreement about these numbers.
I wonder if we look at the present situation in Ukraine, and it's a large country, and you have war zones. Is there any danger of a famine at this present situation? I wonder.
Well, I think potentially yes, because of the destruction of the infrastructure of energy. The agricultural sector has declined significantly, the production. Also, there's an issue of fertilizer, that Russia is the main producer for the whole world. That has decreased significantly, and farmers are not able to export the wheat they grew to be able to invest in the next harvest. So I think potentially. Now, we don't see extreme examples of famine, as far as I can tell. There's no, people have enough to eat for the moment, but if things go on for a long time, potentially, that danger does exist, yes.
Maybe I just can add, it's not about like potential risk of the famine, but it's just about the effect of the ongoing war on population of Ukraine. Even though we don't have accurate statistics on deaths, casualties, military losses due to the war, unfortunately, this information is not available yet, even for us. But based on the estimates, we predict. Also, you know, there is some level of uncertainty in our predictions. We predict a rapid drop, a decline in births next year. This year, maybe not so substantial because, you know, many births conceived in the beginning of the year. But next year, we predict a huge decline in total fertility rate in Ukraine. It was 1.15 children per woman. We have such indicator in the beginning, before the war started. And we assume that next year it could decline, it might decline till 0.5 or 0.6. So it is a huge decline because of many reasons. Because of the war, because of, family breakdowns, family separations, that now only women with children, only women are allowed to cross the border, but men until they're in reproductive ages have to stay within Ukraine. So it's also important reason due to, of course, male losses due to the war. So we predict huge decline in fertility rate. In terms of life expectancy as well, so our prediction shows that in 10 years, population of Ukraine might be at least 20% smaller than before the war, but it depends to a larger extent from migration. If refugees return to Ukraine. So we don't know.
In 2004, I changed my job from a nutritionist into a peace professional, so I thought I should have loads of questions, but not so much. On your map, the darkest areas are bordering other countries. Are you going to work in the future on, for instance, Belarus, Poland, and the regions, the countries bordering Volga German, for instance, or the South Caucasus? Or is that kind of follow-up research not planned? Thank you. Oh yeah, second question. The peak was in June. Was that the start of the harvest? Thank you.
So we do not plan to do analysis in Poland or these other countries. We still have some work to do in Russia because we would like to estimate the mortality for Ukrainians living in Russia, which so far we're not be able to separate, but we have the data now to be able to do that. As far as the peak, no, the peak is in June when the new harvest started coming in. And Stalin changed the rules in terms of just grabbing everything. He decided to a priori decide what percentage of your production you will have to give to the state. So the farmers knew that they had something left and was honored, so there was some incentive to work. But on the other hand, there was some food distributed during this peak of the famine, but the rule was you give that food only to people strong enough to work and are willing to work. If you didn't satisfy that criteria, you didn't get anything. And there's a classic anecdote in a book by Whitcroft, an Australian historian. This director of a hospital writes to the Communist Party chief in local, I have these peasants that are starving to death. I got this food. How do I decide to? The order came in writing. The ones that are strong enough that you can get them up on their 2 feet, give them the food. The others, forget it, let them die. Simple as that. So the ones that survived were the ones that decided, I either follow the order or I die. Simple as that.
I just add that we are very interested in estimating famine losses in the district within Russian Federation bordering with Ukraine. In particular, Voronezh, Kursk, Belgorod Oblast on the one hand, and Ukrainian district, on the other hand. So bordering, if the border Ukraine to Russia makes some differences between Ukrainian and Russian districts in terms of famine losses. We are really interested in this topic.
I'm sorry. I understand that international aid was offered during the Holodomor, but that was refused. Could you say, or is that?
There was no hunger.
Period.
Interestingly enough, there was a famine in 21-23 in the Volga region, in Russia, and in Ukraine. And foreign aid assistance was accepted by Stalin at that time, and then later trickled down to Ukraine. But in 1932, the answer was there's no famine, period. I would like to make one point connecting the famine with the current war. As I mentioned, the second phase of the Holodomor was the use of the famine because there were, even within the Communist Party in Ukraine, people tried to become more independent within the Soviet Union from Russia. So Stalin made a purge of the Communist Party in Ukraine, Ukrainian members, and in order to squash any thought about becoming more independent, famine was used to terrorize precisely the peasant population to make sure that didn't happen. So at that time, there was a kind of a dress rehearsal about what Putin is doing, but when Putin says there is no Ukraine, and anybody says he's Ukrainian, he doesn't know he's really Russian or he's crazy. Actually, this is something not new. Because if you look at the history of the Russian Empire, there has been a consistent policy to try to destroy Ukrainian language, to destroy Ukrainian culture, and assimilate Ukrainians into the Russian Empire. And I can have just a few examples of this policy. In 1863, Minister Valuyev issued a decree prohibiting the printing of books in Ukrainian in the Russian Empire. In 1876, there was additional order that prohibited importing books in Ukrainian into the Russian Empire, prohibiting plays in Ukrainian, and even text in music in Ukrainian. In 1988, Tsar Alexander III is banning the use of Ukrainian in all the government offices and even baptized children with Ukrainian names. In 1930, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was destroyed and taken over by the Moscow Orthodox Church. And just in 1964, the library of the National Academy of Sciences was burned. In 1968, one of the famous monasteries in Kyiv was burned. It reminds what's happening right now in Ukraine. Libraries are being burned, museums looted, destroyed. And interesting anecdote. In 1983, teachers in high school that taught Russian language and literature, their salary was 60% higher than the ones that taught Ukrainian. So there's nothing new about Putin's policy. It's just another chapter of a long history. So the issue of identity you raised is well and alive. And it's the connection we have between the famine and what's happening now, because the intent at that time using the hunger was basically the same as the one now, using drones and rockets to terrorize the population with a similar purpose.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can ask a final two questions for you, maybe about the future. You were speaking about wanting to look into Russian regions and to how this compares to what happened in Ukraine during the Holodomor. And I was wondering whether the current situation enables you to continue your work or how you adapt to what you're doing. Yeah. And the second question is regarding the research that you're showing us tonight. And that is maybe a bit more wishful thinking than or future sort of guessing what will happen. But what would you hope for if there could be any political consequence of what you're writing today? What would you hope for in a broader sense coming from your research?
You want to start on that?
Regarding the data, as I told in the beginning of my talk, we were very lucky to get access to the Russian archives at that time, because now there is no way to get any data. Holodomor issue, especially Holodomor genocide issue, is taboo in Russia. And I don't think that now it's, or in the following years, it's possible to visit. And actually, there is no opportunity and any chance to get some new data from Russian archives. But we have some data which we can use for our future research. As I already mentioned, and Oleg told, that we want to focus on Russian-Ukrainian comparison by nationalities or by districts predominantly dominated by Ukrainians or Russian, something like that. So it's one of the future directions for our research, I would say, yeah.
Yes, as regards to the future, actually, one of our motivations of this research is to, number one, document it to publish in scientific journals so it becomes known in academia. But more importantly, if you take 100 people at random in any country today, you ask them, do you know what Holodomor is? I bet 95 will say, what are you talking about? In other words, this tragedy is very little known, and I think it is our obligation as researchers to try to document it, to show what the true story is with sound research, not propaganda, and inform the people so they know that becomes part of other tragedies, other famines, in other countries, so that it becomes part of the narrative never again. So that people take that as something to teach in schools, so the next generations realize what can happen if you don't defend things like freedom of speech, democracy, etc.
And just one sentence, that it would be really interesting to compare Ukrainian famine to other famines, like Irish famine, Chinese famine, and others. So this cross-famine analysis would be also very interesting.
I could add from a biology point of view, from learning about human development, but this is strictly biological, limited, scientific point of view. The Holodomor famine, because it was so sudden and so well defined, gives a shock that will translate to what happens in humans, but also in animals. And when can we identify sensitive periods for shocks? And we find that the early gestation period is much more sensitive than later periods of gestation, much more sensitive than the period after birth. So that is important to stimulate biological research, to learn about prevention and avoiding exposures, certain exposures. We also learn from comparing famines in Ukraine and in Holland and in China. We can combine our insights, because in some countries we have good documentation about exposures, in other countries good documentation about the outcomes. In Holland we have very good documentation based on blood samples, DNA analysis, where we can look at the changes at the cellular level that are induced by these stresses very early in gestation. So we try and make an overall picture of the biology of these extreme stresses by combining information from different settings, all with their different strengths and weaknesses.
Thank you very much. It shows that both on educational level, scientific level, and societal level, there's still a lot to do. I would like to thank you for your very interesting and magnificent presentation, and for speaking to us, and you for being here, of course, and for your questions tonight. Safe journey home.